One question I'm often asked is, did people eat breakfast during the Middle Ages? And the answer is, it depends. But when they did, sometimes it was this dish that's essentially a medieval version of Cinnamon Toast Crunch, a 15th century recipe for sopes dorées, or golden sops. So thank you to HelloFresh for sponsoring this video as we tuck in to a medieval breakfast, this time on Tasting History. So to answer the question, did medieval people eat breakfast, we're going to have to look at several different time periods and several different classes of people, but the short answer is, yes, they did, sometimes on occasion. For most people, this meant some bread or cheese or ale, maybe some cold porridge left over from the night before. But as you moved up the social ladder, you might be finding something more complex on your breakfast table, as we see in the 14th century story of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight before the men go on a hunt. Full early ere daylight the folk rose up. The knights all arrayed for riding leapt up lightly and took their bridles, and each rode his way as pleased him best. The lord of the land was not the last, ready for the chase with many of his men. He ate a sop hastily when he had heard mass, and then with a blast of the bugle fared forth to the field. He and his nobles were to horse ere daylight glimmered upon the earth. An early morning breakfast of sops. Unfortunately, it doesn't tell us what kind of sops this lord was eating because they really ran the gamut. Sometimes it was just a piece of toasted bread that was dipped in some ale or wine to kind of soften it up, but there are also recipes that are much more complex with eggs added and different spices added. There's even one with fried onions that's kind of like a precursor to French onion soup. In fact, the word sop is where we get the word soup. Essentially, as the toast started to go away and the liquid started to become more prominent, sop turned into soup. Now, the sop that I have decided to make does not have any onions in it, but it is reminiscent of one of my favorite breakfast foods, Cinnamon Toast Crunch, sopes dorées. Take raw almonds and grind them in a mortar, and temper them with wine and draw them through a strainer, and let them boil, and cast thereto saffron, sugar, and salt. And then take a pain de main and cut him and toast him, and wet him in wine, and lay him in a dish, and cast the syrup thereon. Then make a dreg of powdered ginger, sugar, cannel, cloves, and maces, and cast thereon. And when it is ydressed, serve it forth for a good pottage. Now, I left the old spelling in because I feel like you can kind of get the gist of what the modern English would be, but I did pronounce it in a modern way because it sounds very, very different if you don't. Anyway, for this recipe, what you'll need is a pinch of saffron, 2 tablespoons of sugar, a half teaspoon of salt, and several thick slices of white bread. This is what in the recipe they call pain de main or pain de main, which was kind of the nicest white bread that you could get. Then a quarter cup or 60 milliliters of white wine, and then a mixture of spices, and the quantities that you use are really up to you. I'm using a tablespoon of sugar, a half teaspoon of ginger, a half teaspoon of cinnamon, an 1/8 teaspoon of cloves, and a 1/4 teaspoon of mace. And mace in this case is neither the weapon nor the stuff that you spray in an attacker's face, but rather the outside coating of a nutmeg. And it has a similar flavor to a nutmeg, but it packs more of a punch. It's a little bit spicier and it's really good. Then you also need 2 cups or 475 milliliters of almond milk made with wine. People are often surprised when almond milk appears in a medieval recipe. I guess it just seems like a very modern ingredient, but it was actually really common in medieval Europe, and it was made pretty much the same way that it is today. You can just buy some almond milk at the store, some plain almond milk, but I prefer to make my own, especially since this recipe calls for it to be made with wine, which they will not have at the store, and it's actually really easy to make. And now let us make some medieval almond milk with wine, for which you will need 1 cup or 150 grams of raw almonds, 3 cups or 710 milliliters of water, and 1 cup or 235 milliliters of white wine. So first soak the almonds in water overnight. They should become nice and plump, and then drain them. Then you can grind these up by hand, but if you have a blender, now is definitely the time to use it. Just add in the almonds and then the water and the wine and blend for a minute until everything is smooth. Then pour the almond milk through a fine cloth or a nut milk bag, squeezing out as much liquid as possible. And that's your almond milk. So then take 2 cups of that and put it in a saucepan and heat it to a gentle simmer. Then add in the saffron threads and the sugar and salt and stir. And the saffron here is really just to add color. It will add flavor as well, but the color is the most important thing. It is what is going to give the dish its name, sopes dorées or golden sops, and it turns that almond milk a nice golden color. Let it keep simmering, stirring occasionally until it has started to thicken. It'll take about 10 minutes. As it thickens, take your bread slices and set them on a tray, and then put those in the oven at 400 degrees Fahrenheit, 205 Celsius for 6 to 8 minutes or until they have started to turn a golden brown. Then take them out of the oven, flip them over, and return to the oven for another 4 or 5 minutes until they are nicely toasted. Then while the bread is still hot, set it in a dish and drizzle with white wine on the top. Just enough to make it wet, but not to make it soggy. Yet, it will get soggy. By now, the almond milk should have thickened up quite a bit, almost like a custard, and you can pour it around the toast and a little over the top. Then take a good large pinch of the spice mixture and sprinkle that over the top as well. Now this spice mixture actually has a name. It was powder douce, or sweet spices, and it was very common in the kitchens of wealthy medieval people, and it always varied a little bit depending on who the chef was who was making it, but they were always similar, had similar sweet spices, and usually a sugar base. And I've used it a few times here on the channel, including in the recipe for medieval lasagna, which is also in the Tasting History cookbook. So you can use that all to make mostly dinner dishes, but for now, we are going to focus on medieval breakfast. In the Middle Ages, not everyone got breakfast. In fact, some people even considered it a sinful indulgence. Based on the writings of several scholars, including the Summa Theologica by Thomas Aquinas, some members of the church tied eating breakfast to the sin of gluttony. There was an aspect of this sin called prepropere, which referred to eating either too quickly or too soon after a previous meal. So eating first thing in the morning was often considered indulgent, but this doesn't apply to everyone nor at all times. In fact, in the earlier Middle Ages, especially in the British Isles, we know that at least some people were eating breakfast because there are two Old English words, undermette and morgenmette, which meant morning meat, referring to eating food in the early morning. Now, how common it was is up for debate, but it was at least common enough that they required two words for the practice. And Latin also had a word for breakfast. It was iantaculum, though for most of the Middle Ages, iantaculum was not meant to be eaten by everyone. More often it seems that people stuck to a two-meal day. There was the midday meal, prandium, which tended to be the largest meal of the day, and then the lighter evening meal called cena. And still today, in Italian, dinner is called cena. In Spanish, I think it's cena. That's where it comes from. But iantaculum, or breakfast, was the domain of the wealthy, or to those people who society deemed it necessary to eat breakfast. For instance, laborers. Now, depending on the location and the time period, peasants performing manual labor could be up to 80% of the population, which in that case, a lot of people were eating breakfast, and it was usually eaten a few hours after the person got up. In a log from northern France in 1474, it says that from the end of March through the end of September, basically the summer months, the masons working on a particular building were required to start work no later than 5:30 a.m. and had to continue until 8 a.m. when they would have an hour for breakfast. And this was usually bread and cheese that they might have brought from home or be given by the employer, and some beer or ale, and that was very often supplied by the employer as part of your day's wages. When working in the fields, too, people often just sat down right where they were working to eat their morning breakfast. Though you want to make sure that you're in a safe place when you eat your morning breakfast, because in August of 1346, a William Bishop of Oxfordshire was digging a pit when he decided to have breakfast, and he sat down in the pit only to have the pit collapse on him, and it killed him. Now, as it was eaten for those doing manual labor, many likely only indulged in breakfast during the summer months, as that's when the long days of work necessitated it. In the winter, most people just waited for their midday meal. Though if you were either young or sick, you pretty much got breakfast all year round if you needed it. In 1397, at Winchester College, any students under the age of 16 received breakfast every morning. Other members of the society are to have two meals only, prandium and cena. There's this wonderful school book from the 15th century where a student wrote down his experience having breakfast. "My breakfast was brought to my bedside as oft as me list to call therefore. And so many times I was first fed or I were cled," meaning he often ate breakfast before he even got dressed. But that was a nostalgic remembrance of his younger days as a student, for now he had grown into a young adult. "And now at 5 of the clock by the moonlight I must go to my book, and let sleep and sloth alone. Breakfasts that were sometime brought at my bidding is driven out of country, and never shall come again." It's exactly how I feel when I think back upon my youth, eating bowls of cereal and watching Saturday morning cartoons. Given something so precious and then have it cruelly taken away from you. Such is life. It was a similar situation for those people who were ill, and if you were a monk, well, having breakfast came with strings attached. In his monastic constitutions, Lanfranc, the 11th century Archbishop of Canterbury, wrote that after terce, the children and the sickly who cannot fast shall receive the mixtum. Terce was the mid-morning prayer around 9 a.m., and a mixtum was simply any additional meal that was given to a monk. And should you eat this extra meal, especially if it had any meat in it, you had to go through a long process of begging for forgiveness. First, even as he is eating his mixtum, the sick monk had to pull his hood over his head, kind of, I guess, to hide his shame. Then he had to prostrate himself on the floor before all of the other monks to ask for forgiveness, and then ask for absolution from the abbot, saying, "My lord, I have been long in the infirmary, borne down by sickness. I have offended in matters of food and drink and much else, and I have acted against our established discipline. And for this I beg of you absolution." Now, as the centuries went on, it does seem that they relaxed a little bit, but even as late as the 15th century, William Caxton wrote, "Go take the sacrament. It is good breakfast." Now, some people opted for the sacrament and breakfast, but breakfast always came after the sacrament, or going to Mass. Even in the passage from Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, it says he ate a sop hastily when he had heard Mass, because even a lord would not eat breakfast before first doing his morning prayers. And it was the same for children. King Edward IV wrote regarding one of his sons, the infamous Princes in the Tower, that item, "We will that our said son have his breakfast immediately after his Mass, and between that and his meat to be occupied in such virtuous learning as his age shall now suffice to receive." So first he went to Mass, and then he had breakfast, and then he had his schooling. And it probably wasn't just his son who was eating breakfast, but the king himself, because by the late medieval period, most of the aristocracy deemed breakfast a most necessary indulgence. Even as far back as 1305, King Edward I, the Longshanks, employed a cook whose designated duty was to prepare breakfast for him at his court, which was constantly moving about the country. He was recorded as Roger ate bece, cocus de gentaculo, cook for breakfast. And what exactly was old King Edward eating? Well, many times it would have just been a fancier version of what the peasants were eating. Bread, ale, cheese, that kind of stuff. But sometimes they would have had something a little bit more complicated. In a 15th century document from the home of Cicely Neville, the Duchess of York and mother of 2 future kings of England, it lays out her and her husband's breakfasts at different times of the year. For most of the year there were breakfasts for my lord and my lady. First a loaf of bread in trenchers, 2 manchets, 1 quart of beer and a quart of wine, half a shin of mutton or else a shin of beef boiled. Manchet, like the pain de main in our recipe, was simply a very nice form of white bread. So it was essentially what the peasants were eating. You had the bread and the beer, though you also had wine and you had meat. And that's really what makes it a very different meal than what the peasants were having. During Lent, it was the same, but instead of meat, they had pieces of saltfish, 6 baconed herring, or a dish of sprats. Now, since it was Lent, bacon couldn't have referred to like pork bacon. So I'm thinking that baconed herring referred to the method of like curing or smoking the herring, but I'm not entirely sure. I searched and I wasn't quite convinced, but that's what I assume. What else is cool about these old documents, though, is not only does it say what they were getting, what the lord and lady were getting for breakfast, but also it talks about who else was even being served breakfast. Around the year 1400, breakfasts be there none, saving only the head officers when they be present. To the ladies and gentlewomen, to the dean and to the chapel, to the almoner, to the gentlemen ushers, to the cofferer, to the clerk of the kitchen, and to the marshal. These breakfasts, of course, were not as fancy as the ones that the lord and lady were getting. The cupbearers, for instance, had a loaf of bread, a bottle of beer, and a piece of saltfish. And for those working in the stables, well, they just got the beer and bread. Now, as the late medieval period gave way to the early Tudor period, breakfast started to become more common. You see it a lot more in the writings of the period, but for the majority of people, for the next few centuries, they kind of stuck to that diet of beer, bread, sometimes wine, cheese. That was breakfast. Only the wealthy started to play and make things a little more interesting. Like in 1501, Edward Stafford, the 3rd Duke of Buckingham, often enjoyed a full spread of fish for breakfast, including pike, roach, and plaice, along with a dish of butter and eggs. And perhaps in the future I'll do a video on the breakfasts of Tudor England, but for now I am going to stick to my medieval breakfast of golden sops. And here we are, sopes dorées from 15th century England. So it really is soggy bread. I mean, that's what it is. And it is bread that you sop up juice. That's where the name came from. And as the bread went away and more liquid ended up coming around, it just became soup. But it smells wonderful. You really get the saffron, you really get the spices. Here we go. It's messy, but it's really good. So I was worried that the wine was going to be the dominant flavor and kind of overpower everything else, but it doesn't. It's there, maybe, but it's more of, you just kind of get a little bit of the burn of the alcohol, but the flavor is the spices and is the almond milk and saffron, and there's a sweetness to it. It kind of reminds me of like a custard, that sauce. It's thick and it's flavorful, and it makes it so that when the bread does sop it up, it doesn't become so soggy that it just falls apart. It is still, you know, it's holding on there. The spices that you add, I think I could probably even add more. It does have that kind of cinnamon toast crunch flavor to it, but you add even more and you're definitely in cinnamon toast crunch land. It's really quite good. Definitely not something I would think of to have for breakfast today because it is kind of messy. But the flavor's good, and I guess maybe I should have it for breakfast. If it was good enough for a medieval lord, then it's good enough for me. What I also love is that you get the color, that doré, the gold. It does have a bit of a gold hue to it, so you do get that color, so the name absolutely makes sense. So go treat yourself like a medieval lord or lady and make some sopes dorées, and I will see you next time on Tasting History. When you think of eating like a medieval peasant, you probably imagine a monotonous diet of cheap bread, stale ale, and peas porridge hot, peas porridge cold, peas porridge in the pot 9 days old. And you'd mostly be correct. But there were times, like at the harvest boon work, when even the lowest serf was fed beef, cheese, fine quality bread, and fish, like this dish of fish and garlic sauce from a 15th century cookbook. So thank you to Bombas for sponsoring this video as we learn how to feed a medieval peasant. This time on Tasting History. Now, depending on when and where you are during the medieval period, a peasant could have varying degrees of both wealth and freedom. But regardless, 80 to 95% of the people were still classified as someone that we would call peasants, who owed a certain amount of work to their lord. Typically, in addition to farming your own strip of land, which you rented from the lord, you would have to spend several days a week farming their strips of land. But then a few times of work, there was something called a boon day, which was basically an extra day of work. It's kind of like when your manager tells you that everyone is coming in on Saturday to do inventory, but he's going to bring in pizza to make it a little bit nicer. And there was a medieval version of the pizza party. All who have come to the wheat harvest boon work shall have for dinner soup, wheaten bread, beef, and cheese, and for supper bread, cheese, and their fill of ale. And the other day they shall have soup, wheaten bread, fish, and cheese, and their fill of ale. At dinner each shall have as much bread as he wishes to eat, and at supper a loaf apiece. Also, I found that quote through Jenny Draper, or Jay Draper, who is a wonderful person to follow and a wonderful person to take a tour from if you're going to London. Now, it seems that at this medieval work pizza party, you would be fed your fill of cheese and ale and bread and beef and fish. And since it's been a long time since I've done a fish recipe on the channel, I decided to do a fish recipe, but I had to find one that was appropriate for a peasant, meaning it couldn't have a lot of spices, which most recipes from this period did. And that's because most of the recipes that were written down were for the wealthy. But I did find a simple recipe for something called barbel, and this fish is perfect. Because the barbel, though he be of a fine shape and looks big, yet he is not accounted the best fish to eat. And I feel that that is exactly the kind of fish that the Lord would be giving to his peasants. So this recipe, which comes from around 1450, is for barbel boiled. Take a barbel and cut him, and draw him round, and pike in the nape of the head, and seethe him in water and salt, ale and parsley. And when it beginneth to boil, skim it clean, and cast the barbel thereto, and seethe him. And his sauce is garlic or verge sauce, and then serve him forth. Now I searched high and low for barbel, but I just could not find them, at least here in the US. What they are is a river bottom feeding fish in the carp family. So I was able to find some fillets of carp, but even those were actually quite difficult to come by. So if you want to use catfish, I think that's probably going to be also pretty close. So for this recipe, what you'll need is about 1.5 pounds or 700 grams of fish, 2 teaspoons of salt, 3/4 of a cup of parsley leaves, 1 quart or 1 liter of ale. Now you're probably not going to find the type of ale that they had during the Middle Ages. That is really something that you need to make on your own, and I will be doing that for a future video, but not today. Today, you just find something that is low in hops, and that'll do. You'll also need about 3 quarts or 3 liters of water. So first add the ale to a pot, and then add the water and the salt and set it on the stove to boil. Now you don't want this to be a vigorous boil, just a gentle simmer really. Then you add in the parsley leaves, and then finally the fish. And depending on how thick the fish is, or if it's a whole fish, it's going to take anywhere from 5 to 8 minutes to cook. Now ideally you would use a fish that is either whole or at least has the skin on it. I wasn't able to get that. I do think that that would at least make it hold together a little bit better, because taking it out once it is cooked is a little bit difficult. It really just wants to kind of fall apart. So frankly, I think that grilling the fish or roasting the fish or pretty much any other way of cooking this fish would be preferred, and that's how we would do it today. But during the Middle Ages, they really liked to boil pretty much everything, both meat and fish and anything else. So that's how we're going to do it. And as much as I do enjoy medieval cooking, I gotta say I'm never gonna get used to the boiled meat and the boiled fish. I'm just not really a fan. And now, once you have boiled your fish, make sure to keep the liquid, because we're gonna need some of that for the sauce. Now, the original recipe says that it will work with either a garlic sauce or a verga sauce, or green sauce, which is something made with herbs, and I made that a few years back, so I'm gonna go with the garlic. And luckily, I found a 15th century recipe that says, take kernels of walnuts and cloves of garlic and pepper, bread and salt, and cast all in a mortar, and grind it small, and mix it up with the same broth that the fish was sodden in, and serve it forth. Very simple and appropriate for the peasantry, because it only has one spice, pepper, rather than many spices, which most sauces from this time have. So for this sauce, what you'll need is 3/4 of a cup or 80 grams of walnuts, 2 cloves of garlic, crushed, a half teaspoon of pepper, 1 cup of stale breadcrumbs, 1/2 teaspoon of salt, and 1 cup or 235 milliliters of the boiling liquid. So you can crush everything up in a mortar if you like, or you can just add all of the ingredients, except for the liquid, to a blender and grind everything together. Then add that to a pot along with the liquid. Now the recipe doesn't actually say that this should be cooked, and there are some uncooked sauces from this period, but very often when they include breadcrumbs, it needs to be cooked simply because the breadcrumbs are then going to act as a thickener. Also, the raw garlic is going to be very, very strong if we don't cook it, so I'm going to cook it for just about 5 minutes on very low heat, and that will let the sauce thicken up. And as it thickens, just a reminder that if you want a signed copy of the Tasting History Cookbook before the holidays, now is getting to be the last chance to order them, so I'll put a link in the description to where you can order those. They do ship internationally and domestically. And now, let us take a look at how to feed a medieval peasant, or rather, how the medieval peasants fed everyone else. So when you discuss the peasantry of medieval Europe, it's very easy to kind of see them as a monolith. They were all poor and exactly the same, but they were not at all. They were a very diverse group. Some were very wealthy, some were very poor, and there were different levels of freedom. There were those who, while they paid rent to their lord and were obliged to work their land, were also free to move or start small businesses on the side, like brewing ale or weaving cloth, businesses that could eventually make them very wealthy. Then there were those who were typically not free to do those things, the serfs or villeins. This was typically a much larger portion of the population and were effectively tethered to the lord's land and not free to leave. Now, what all of these people, all of the peasants, had in common was that they typically worked the land to feed not only themselves, but also everyone above them, be it the church, the nobility, or the royals. As the 14th century chronicler Jean Froissart put it, it is a custom in England, as in several other countries, for the nobility to have great power over the commoners, who they keep in bondage. That is to say, their tenants ought by custom to labor the Lord's land, to harvest his grain, and to make their hay, and cut their wood, and bring it home. So in practice, how it worked was a lord would have a manor, or very often many manors, that were a couple hundred to a few thousand acres large, and they would divide much of that up into strips of land and give those to a peasant family to work. Now, they weren't giving them to them. The peasant family had to pay rent to work that land. And usually that rent came in a portion of what was grown on the land, or sometimes in cash, or it was a mixture of both. And then also it was paid in additional labor on the land that the lord had not rented out. So you find documents from this period that detail exactly what every single peasant owes to their lord. In addition, it would tell you how much work a peasant had to do for their lord each year. And sometimes it wasn't very much at all, just a few days a year when the harvest came in and stuff like that. But then sometimes it was a lot of work. Like Reynold at Sol holds 1 vergate of land and must work for the first 4 days in every week throughout the year. And if any feast day shall fall on these days, it shall be allowed him as a working day. Then the document goes on to specify that should it not be the time of year that the actual crops need tending to, because it was pretty seasonal, there was plenty of other work that the peasant had to do. Whether that was making fences, he had to do 32 feet a year. Hedges, 24 feet a year. He also had to muck out the stalls and make straw and all of these other things. So yes, he was working 4 days a week and had holidays off, but he was still working a lot throughout the year. And that's why you'll see this meme online that says a medieval peasant didn't work as many days as you do. That is so not true. First of all, they worked from sunup till sundown doing backbreaking work, and that was just the work that they had to do for the Lord. They also still had to work their own land all of the rest of the time, so they didn't really get days off. And that's why when the peasants finally got a chance to free themselves from this never-ending cycle of backbreaking work for subsistence wages, they decided to do something about it. See, the first half of the 14th century was pretty much horrible for everyone. The previous few centuries had been what was called the medieval warm period, and that was because Europe was uncharacteristically warm. They were even growing grapes in central England, and it made it so harvests in general were very good, which led to population growth. For instance, in England, where the records are pretty well kept, the population doubled by many accounts, if not more, between the years 1100 and 1300, from about 2 million, 2.5 million to 5 million or something like that. And it was because they had so much food. But around the year 1300, the continent began to slide into what is known as the Little Ice Age, which led not only to a change in growing patterns, i.e. no more grapes in England, but also just a lot more failed crops in general. From 1315 to 1317, a series of heavy rains and disease among livestock led to the Great Famine, which ravaged all of Europe, leading to an 80% decline in food production in many places. Food prices rose between 100 and 300% in just a couple of years, and nobody was spared. In Bristol, the Annals of Bristol in 1315, it says a great famine of dearth, with such mortality that the living could scarce suffice to bury the dead. Horseflesh and dog's flesh was accounted good meat, and some eat their own children. The death toll during the Great Famine is estimated to be between 10 and 20% of the population in some places, which, while tragic, was merely a prelude to what was going to come. Because in 1346, the Black Death first came to Europe, and in less than a decade, 30 to 50% of the population was dead. Some villages saw a 100% mortality rate, so that by the latter half of the century, there were no longer enough peasants alive to work the fields of the nobility. Now, the decreased population was not the only factor that led to what happened in the second half of the century, but it was a major factor because with less people, those remaining people could demand more for their labor should they be able to leave and do that. But most people, a good portion of the population, especially in England, were serfs. And so even if the manor next door said, hey, I'll give you 2 shillings and a pig if you come work my fields for the week, and your lord was saying, no, I'm going to still pay you what I was paying your grandfather 50 years ago, you had to go work for that guy. You weren't allowed to take that new job at the new price. Now, I know this is going to seem like a stretch, but just imagine living in the years after a Great Plague when prices have skyrocketed because of a lack of supply and a lack of labor. But you are still living off of wages that have pretty much remained stagnant for decades, so you can't afford the rent and the food anymore. Just imagine that. Well, this frustration naturally led to a series of revolts, mostly amongst the peasantry throughout Europe in the latter half of the 14th century, and the most well-documented took place in England. There, things had been exacerbated by high taxes to pay for the 100 Years' War, and there was a lack of trust in the courts and the officials of King Richard II. And finally, a poll tax was implemented. And this poll tax was 4p per person. Whether you were dirt poor, it was 4p, or fabulously wealthy, it was still 4p. And so that was actually the final trigger that in May of 1381 instigated an uprising amongst different classes of people from Kent led by Wat Tyler. On June 13th, the rebel army crossed London Bridge and entered the city, opening prisons, burning the homes of people like John of Gaunt, one of the richest men in England, and perhaps most importantly, they were there to destroy documents. All sorts of court documents, but many were the types of documents that I've been reading from today, the ones that said exactly how much a person owes to their lord and who is servile to who. They strove to burn all old records, and they butchered anyone who might know or be able to commit to memory the contents of old or new documents. It was dangerous enough to be known as a clerk, but especially dangerous if an inkpot should be found at one's elbow. Such men scarcely or ever escaped from the hands of the rebels. On the 15th of June, Wat Tyler and the rebels met at Smithfield, outside of London, to put their demands to King Richard II, who had promised to pardon all involved. Among other things, their demands included an end to serfdom, meaning a peasant could leave the land for a better offer, a right to work other jobs, that is, a right to have a side hustle, and a right to rent land at a just price, because the rent was just too damn high. Now, at first, the king seemed amenable to this, but then one of his men insulted Wat Tyler, and Wat Tyler attacked him, supposedly, allegedly attacked him, and that led to Wat Tyler getting slashed with a sword and eventually beheaded. And at that point, the king also kind of turned around and said, you know what, I'm not pardoning everyone. Everyone who was involved is going to be hunted down and executed. Most importantly, he didn't give in to any of their demands. Rather, he is quoted as saying, "Villains you are, and villains you shall remain." Villains being another word for serf. But while he did not end the practice of serfdom in England, which had already started to die out, it did begin to accelerate the process because many serfs were just willing to take the price of possible punishment in order to find a much better job paying much better wages. In fact, serfdom officially didn't go away in England until 1574, 200 years later, when Queen Elizabeth officially ended the practice in England. And the system of peasants paying for their rent with food and work eventually just kind of evolved into the system that we have now, where we pay with money. Now, obviously, life now is very, very different than life in the Middle Ages, much better. But it is interesting to kind of see some of the parallels of just how people behaved and how people worked and different practices. Like now, when your boss wants you to come in for some extra work, they will bribe you with food. That would be pizza or maybe cupcakes. In the Middle Ages, you would be bribed with cheese, bread, meat, ale, and something like this dish of fish. And here we are, a 15th century fish with garlic and walnut sauce, perfect for a medieval peasant. So first I'm going to just start with a piece of the fish, get it off. There are bones in this, I am realizing. A lot of bones. Just going to taste the fish by itself. All right, I was wrong. Boiled fish is actually just fine. I guess it's sort of like poached fish. Never had carp. It's actually quite nice. I wonder if it's farmed instead of like been eating mud. I don't know. It's actually quite good. Anyway, let me try the sauce. So I'll just dip a bit into some of the sauce. Now the sauce is rather grainy. Let me get a little bit here. You can see, especially as it cools, it starts to really thicken up. It's just from the breadcrumbs. It is rather grainy. You can strain it. They very often did. If you have like large pieces, you can strain those out, but you don't want to strain it too much to get it too thin because then you're going to lose the walnuts and everything, and I think that's going to be most of the flavor. Here we go. That's garlicky. But not overpowering. I actually wish it was more walnut. I guess walnut's a pretty mild flavor in comparison with garlic. You know, so many sauces from this period are flavored with a lot of spices and vinegar. Most of them you'll actually find are vinegar-based sauces. So this is kind of unique and a nice change. I mean, I guess if you're a peasant, this is the way to go. It's nothing to revolt over, but it's also nothing to write home about. Definitely gonna eat that cheese and bread though, and the ale. So overall, not a bad meal, nothing to write home about. I'm very glad that I'm not a medieval peasant, but it's a good dish, you know. It's hearty and would make for a good after-work meal on a boon day where you've been harvesting all day. Luckily, I'm not harvesting all day, so, you know, that's good. Anyway, I'll see you next time on Tasting History. Today, I thought it was about time for a return to form of curry. See what I did there? Yes, I'm going to that medieval cookbook which I know and love so well, The Form of Curry, for a dish called maca. It's basically beans and fried onions. Good, hearty peasant food. And that is exactly what we're going to be discussing today. So thank you to the Great Courses Plus for sponsoring this video as we try to suss out what a medieval peasant might eat. This time on Tasting History. Now, if you've ever watched an episode of Tasting History where I cook from the form of curry, and I'll put a link up here to one of my favorites, you'll know that the recipes in the book were actually written for King Richard II, hardly a peasant. But the problem is, we don't have any recipes for peasants because nobody cared what they ate. But we can look through the form of curry and find some recipes that would have the ingredients that might be available to peasants. So that really narrows it down because almost every recipe in the book has a ton of spices, and peasants would not have any spices. But this recipe for maca has only a few ingredients that we'll kind of have to change up. Otherwise, it's nice and simple, good peasant food. Maca. Take drawn beans and seed them well. Take them up of the water and cast them in a mortar. Grind them all to dust till they be white as any milk. Chauffe a little red wine. Cast thereamong in the grinding, do thereto salt, lesh it in dishes. Then take onions and mince them small, and seed them in oil till they be all brown, and flourish the dishes therewith, and serve it forth. Wonderfully simple and frankly, a pretty good side dish for Thanksgiving if, like me, you insist on subjecting your family to medieval cooking. So what you'll need is 3 cups or 450 grams of beans. Now most of the beans that we use today would not have been available in medieval Europe. They're all New World beans. If you want to use something that is appropriate to the era, the closest thing that you're probably going to get are broad beans or fava beans. Though they're not going to be white like in the recipe. So no matter how much you grind them up, they're never going to be white. They're more of a green, but those are going to be the closest thing. Fava beans. That said, I say use whatever bean makes you happy. A half cup to 1 cup of red wine or ale. Now here's one of the ingredients that we're going to swap out. The recipe calls for red wine, but in England, in the Middle Ages, red wine not really available to many peasants, so we're going to go with ale. You could also use mead perhaps if you want something sweeter. Also, the amount that you use is really up to you. It doesn't say, so it's kind of how thick you want your bean dish. Salt to taste, an onion minced, and then oil or butter for frying. So here's the other ingredient that we're going to swap out, because the oil in the recipe probably refers to olive oil, which King Richard would have been using, imported from Italy. Way too expensive for a peasant. But a peasant might be sharing a cow with their neighbor, or maybe even have a cow themselves, so they would have had plenty of butter. That said, the low smoke point of butter, going to be hard to fry onions in. Not impossible, but you might want to add in a little bit of olive oil just to cheat. You could also use lard, which many peasants would have as well. So first, take your beans and wash them, and then fill a pot with water and boil them. Now, depending on what bean you're going to use, they're going to have different consistencies. Fava beans kind of tend to disintegrate and just take up a lot of water. So the water pretty much all disappeared. I kept adding some, but it just would boil away or go into the beans. And then the beans turn to mush. If you're using something a little bit harder, like a red bean, then those will probably stay firm. That said, we're going to be mashing them up anyway, so it doesn't really matter. Once they're cooked, remove them from the pot and grind them up in a bowl. Then pour your wine or ale into a small saucepan and gently heat, then pour it over the beans and mix it all together. Then mix in your salt and dish the beans into a bowl. And now for the onions, take a pan and put it over medium heat, and then pour in your oil or melt your butter, and then add the onions and fry them until brown. Now browning the onions can take between 7 and 10 minutes, which is perfect, because I am just aching to tell you a bit about medieval peasant food. Now people are always asking me, how do I do my research? And frankly, if I went through the process, I would bore you to tears. But I often start with a course on the Great Courses Plus. It's a subscription on-demand video learning service with lectures on every subject you could possibly think of, not just food and history. And the teachers teaching the courses are truly world-class. It was actually where I was first introduced to Ken Albala, who is an amazing food history instructor, and he has a course called Cooking Across the Ages, which is a fantastic place to start. So, if like me, you have a lifelong love of learning, go visit thegreatcoursesplus.com/tastinghistory, link in the description, to start your free trial today. It's also going to make a great Hanukkah or Christmas gift, I would think. Anyway, let's get back to medieval peasants. Actually, before we delve into what a medieval peasant might eat, let us turn to that 14th century chronicler Jean Froissart to see what a medieval peasant or serf actually was. It is the custom in England, as in other countries, for the nobility to have great power over the common people, who are their serfs. This means that they are bound by law and custom to plow the fields of their masters, harvest the corn, gather it into barns, and thresh and winnow the grain. They must also mow and carry home the hay, cut and collect wood, and perform all manner of tasks of this kind. So yeah, today we are talking about the bottom rung of society, and that is fine. The problem is that if you're busy winnowing your lord's grain, that didn't really sound right, then you don't have time to log everything that you're eating. It was long before Instagram. So we don't have any recipes. But we can still extrapolate from other writings and other recipes of the day, as well as archaeology, what they would have eaten. Also, medieval peasants are not a monolith, and nor was their diet, because the medieval period covers up to 1,000 years, depending on who you talk to. Things are going to change in that time. Also, the space that we're talking about, all of Europe, It's huge. People in Italy are going to be eating differently than people in England or the Holy Roman Empire or Russia, so take everything in this episode with a grain of salt, which is a perfect place to start. See, a lot of people think that salt was really expensive during the Middle Ages, and that could be true. But it could also not be true. It really depended on where you were. See, most of the sources of salt in medieval Europe were either inland salt springs or the ocean. So if you lived on the coast, getting salt wasn't going to be that hard or expensive because you could just evaporate your own. That said, separating salt from sand actually takes a lot of work, so you might have some sand in your salt. But, at least you have salt. That said, most people weren't using it to spice their food, but rather to preserve their food, so a little sand ain't gonna kill you. But if you were looking for flavor, then you might have some salt, but you weren't going to have any of the spices that the wealthy people had. Instead, you would probably rely on herbs, which you could grow in your own garden attached to your cottage, called a potager. They would grow all sorts of herbs in these gardens, from sorrel and sage and mint and rosemary and thyme, and frankly a lot more herbs than we would use today. And one that they grew, which technically isn't an herb, but they treated it as such, was garlic. And for most of the period, it was associated with the poor. There's actually a wonderful quote from the 15th century, rather snooty Italian author Sabadino degli Arienti, where he says, "Garlic is always a rustic food, but at times is artificially made elegant if placed in the cavity of a roasted duck." Artificially made elegant. What a snob. Anyway, like garlic, which is technically a vegetable, they would also grow other vegetables. Carrots and cabbage and beans and peas and leeks and onions. And if they were really lucky, they might even have a couple fruit trees or wild berries. Though some fruits were actually kind of kept away from the peasantry and were rather prized, depending on where you were in Europe. Peaches, for example. In Le Poretani, by the same author who talked about the garlic, he gives a wonderful story about a peasant, and he gets caught for stealing and eating a peach that was meant to be for the local knight. And he actually blames it on a donkey, but the knight does not believe him and beats him mercilessly. It's kind of sad, actually. But it was rather common. See, punishing peasants for the poaching of prized provisions was rather a popular pastime for the posh. The laws varied wildly throughout Europe, but in Norman England, they had something called forest law. All hunting in the Silva Regis, or Kingswood, which is basically all of the good forestry where there was game animal, was forbidden to actually anyone except for the king unless he gave a special dispensation, which he could probably, often give to those friends that he had. But if you didn't have Lord in front of your name, you weren't going to be having any boar or venison or pheasant anytime soon. And if you were caught poaching one of these animals, then the punishment could be rather severe. It could be as innocuous as castration or losing a hand or maybe blinding, but then it could also be death. And there are stories, though I wasn't able to find any contemporary sources, but there are stories that in parts of what's now Germany, it was practiced to take the skin of whatever animal had been killed and wrap it around the person and then set dogs on them to kill them. Very like Game of Thrones, Ramsay Bolton. Possibly not true, but who knows? So it's no surprise that the poor tended to get their protein from eggs and dairy. And one of the things that they ate a lot of was something called green cheese, which was an unaged cheese that no wealthy person would be caught eating, but the poor tended to like it because it didn't take a lot of time to make. And actually my very first episode of Tasting History was on making this green cheese. Ah, memories. Now, peasants did eat some meat. Some animals were raised, and there was some hunting allowed. Hedgehogs, rabbits, small birds, badgers, and of course the occasional pig, because pigs were everywhere in medieval Europe, especially in England, because they kept the streets clean. There were actually pigs in London during the 14th and 15th century called St. Anthony's pigs, who roamed the city wearing bells around their necks. It was actually considered an act of charity to feed those pigs, and then when the pigs got fat enough, they would either be sold or slaughtered and given to the poor. Now, if you weren't lucky enough to have a pig, then another great source of protein was fish. They had a lot of it, depending again on where you lived. If you lived near a river, you could catch salmon or trout or beaver. Yes, beaver was a fish, and I discussed that in my episode on Lenten foods. There were a lot of weird foods that were considered fish, including puffin. So if you lived near the coast, you could have a puffin, or eel, or crab, or any of the fish that come from the sea, except no porpoises and no whales, which were also considered fish, because there were laws where only the king got to eat those. In fact, there were actually a lot of laws on fishing, just as there were laws on forestry. But it was much more common, and that was a great source of protein for peasants. But there was one great equalizer in the diets of both the rich and poor alike of medieval Europe, and that was carbs, most often in the form of either a thickener for pottages or as bread. The quality of bread, of course, varied wildly. While the wealthy might be dining on wastel and rastons made of fine white wheat flour, the poor would be having barley and oats and rye and maslin. But when times were tough, and times were often tough, they would make horse bread, which was made of dried peas and beans and whatever else you could find. Oddly enough, one of the good things that came out of the Black Death in the mid-14th century was the increased availability of wheat to the masses. In 1394, a plowman in Lincolnshire received 15 loaves a week as payment, 7 of which had to be made of wheat. Now, the last and perhaps best way to get your calories through carbs was to drink them. And at least in Northern Europe, that typically meant either ale or mead. Because with every meal, you'd have a bit of ale or mead unless you were drinking water. And yes, they did drink water in the Middle Ages, despite what you may have been told. But they also drank a lot of mead and ale because you didn't need to worry if it was clean or not. Had alcohol and it killed everything. Though many of the ales at the time were called small ales, which were much lower in alcohol because the purpose was not to get drunk, it was simply to have something safe to drink. Now, the further south you go in Europe, the more likely wine becomes the drink of choice even for the peasants. But in England, not so, and frankly, that might be for the best, because it seems that even then, just like today, France kept the good stuff for themselves and shipped the swill abroad. Around 1175, on visiting the English court of King Henry II, Peter of Blois lamented, "The wine is turned sour and mouldy, thick, greasy, stale, flat, and smacking of pitch. I have sometimes seen even great lords served with wine so muddy that a man must needs close his eyes and clench his teeth, wry-mouthed and shuddering, and filtering the stuff rather than drinking." And that is why I swapped out wine for ale today in our recipe. Speaking of which, it should be about ready. So once your onions are nicely browned, you can do as the form of curry commands and flourish the dish therewith. Then serve it forth. And here we are, maca, or beans and onions. Let's give it a try. I'm gonna get lots of onions because I like grilled onions. It's very hearty. Honestly, this could be a whole friggin' meal. It's just like a bunch of beans. It's very simple. It's not flavorless by any means, but it's very simple. That said, I wouldn't fault you for throwing in some other spices or herbs or something to kind of liven up the flavor, but if you like onions especially, just add more onions. That's what I'm going to do, because they really kind of give that wonderful sweet caramelized onion flavor to it. But it's good. It's not amazing, but, you know, it's peasant food. This alongside a piece of salmon, it'd be lovely. I could get that at Whole Foods. Now, if you enjoyed this video, let me know, because maybe I could do a whole mini-series. I could cover the foods of medieval monks and the medieval tradesmen and what a knight might eat during the Middle Ages. If you'd be interested, let me know in the comments. So make sure to click the link in the description for your Great Courses Plus free trial, and I will see you next time on Tasting History. The tradition of eating corned beef and cabbage on St. Patrick's Day is relatively new, but the dish itself goes way back. So today we're making corned beef and cabbage as it might have been eaten in early medieval Ireland. So for the cabbage portion of this dish, what you'll need is 1 large head of cabbage, 1 large onion, 2 leeks, 2 cups of beef broth, 1 teaspoon of salt, and an optional teaspoon of pepper. So corned beef is always rather salty, but you can reduce the saltiness to an edible level by putting it in a pot of water and then boiling it for a minute. Then drain it and then do it at least once again. This is actually how they desaltified meats back in the medieval age, so it is appropriate. Then mix the salt into the honey and slather it all over the corned beef. Then wrap the corned beef in some foil and place it on a baking sheet or in a roasting pan and set it in the oven at 325 degrees Fahrenheit or 165 Celsius, and you're gonna cook this for about an hour a pound. So interesting note about corned beef is that its association with St. Patrick's Day is more of an American invention than an Irish one. See, while corned beef was incredibly popular in Ireland in the Middle Ages, its popularity eventually waned in favor of pork. Partly because cows take up a lot more room than pigs do, and they're a lot more expensive to maintain, but also because a lot of the good corned beef was being shipped across the sea to England. Surprise, surprise. So in Ireland, the dish became cabbage and bacon. Well, then in the 19th century, mainly due to the Irish potato famine, a lot of Irish people ended up immigrating to America. But in the neighborhoods where they tended to be, the butchers were kosher butchers, so they didn't have any bacon to give. What they did have was plenty of wonderful corned beef brisket, and so that's what the American Irish population began making on St. Patrick's Day. I'm guessing that they didn't realize that they were actually going way back to their old Irish roots by switching over to the corned beef. As for the cabbage, well, every place has cabbage, so that probably didn't really change. And to make the cabbage, you're going to quarter it, and then chop the onions fine, and chop the leeks into half rings. Then put everything into a pot, sprinkle with a little salt, and the pepper if you wish, and then pour in the beef broth and set it on the stove until it's boiling. Then reduce the heat until it's just simmering and cover it, letting it cook for 20 to 30 minutes. And while it cooks, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe. I promise it'll give you the luck of the Irish. And let's go back to medieval Ireland, a time when cows dominated the landscape of Hibernia. Now, when it comes to the cuisine of medieval Ireland, it can really be broken up into two periods, before the Norman invasion and after. And for our purposes, we will focus on the before times. A time of warring clans and kingdoms and of bustling Viking cities like Cork and Dublin. It was a fascinating time, but like I said, they didn't leave us any recipes, but that doesn't mean that they didn't leave us some wonderful writings on food, because a lot of the poetry and the law books of the time had a lot to say about food because it was the cornerstone of society. Food was actually how many people paid their rent, and what you ate determined your place on the social ladder. Or rather, your place on the social ladder often determined what you ate. Even the mythical cauldron of restitution on the Hill of Tara made sure to keep people in their place. Essentially, this cauldron was a never-ending bounty of food, and you would stick your fork in and pull out some food, so that no party ever went away from it unsatisfied. But even then, what came out was sufficient for the company according to their grade and rank. Yes, even a mythical cauldron made sure to keep everyone on their rung of the ladder. So let's start on the bottom rung. The bottom rung was actually 7 rungs, 7 different levels of peasant. And the law books were very specific on what everyone would get when food was being handed out. Now, everyone had the basic diet of grains, usually barley and oats, and dairy products, which they called white meats. And even the lowliest level of peasant was due their grains, milk, and cheese, but he is not entitled to butter. That's right, butter was a clear indication of where you fell in society. Did you get butter? How much butter did you get? And what kind of butter was it? There are actually stories of people showing off their wealth by buttering their bread on both sides, which seems a little excessive and frankly not very practical, but there it is. So no butter at the lowest rung, but as you move up, you do at least get some additional side dishes. A wooden mug 12 inches tall filled with thickened sour milk, and a full-sized loaf of bread, though the word loaf here is kind of misleading. It was probably more like a flatbread made of oats and barley. It was a foot wide, and a man's little finger measures it in thickness. Another rung up, and you received 2 loaves of a woman's baking. And if you were lucky, these might be made of wheat or rye. One legal text describes them as 2 fists in width and a fist in thickness. Another rung up and you get 5 loaves and a choice of milk or butter, though the choice was not yours, but that of your lord or whoever was handing out the butter and milk. Also, this butter probably wouldn't have been much to write home about because the peasants were not entitled to fresh butter, but rather heavily salted butter for preservation purposes. Another way that they preserved butter was by making bog butter. Essentially, it was butter that was pressed into a wooden container and then buried in a peat bog, and even without salt, it would stay edible, if not maybe a little funky, for years. Now, these peasants had a lot of uses for butter other than just putting it on their bread. In one story, a Viking named Ingolf was desperately thirsty, but they had no water around. So his Irish slaves formed the plan of kneading meal and butter together and said it would quench his thirst. They called it minnetak. Though in the story, as soon as they make it, it ends up raining, and so he doesn't need it anymore. Though in other writings from the time, they talk about this mixture of butter and flour or meal being used as a roux to thicken porridge. It was also often put on bread along with some salted onion relish. And the next level of peasant would get that onion relish, but only on Sundays. On other days, they would get vegetables and some form of salted meat, usually venison. Now mind you, all of this is only when there was food to go around, because if there was a famine, and there was often famine, then the peasants were always the first to feel its effects. Great famine in the spring, so that a man would sell his son and his daughter for food, and men would even eat one another, and dogs. All land was almost emptied and scattered throughout Ireland on account of the famine. But provided you weren't starving and you were at the top of the peasant ladder, then you got everything I've already mentioned, but just more of it. 8 loaves of bread, salt on the side, onions, butter, and salted meat on the 3rd, 5th, 9th, and 10th days, and on Sunday. And the meat started to vary. Sometimes it would even be fresh. It'd usually be venison, but goats and sheep and pigs were also available. Pig was especially popular during the festival of Samhain, and there was even a specific dish called the Piglet of Samhain. And in one 9th century love poem, a young man woos his lady love with a promise of pork. O woman, if you come to my firm folk, a crown of gold will be on your head. Fresh pork, ale, milk, and drink shall you have with me there, fair lady. Though the gold crown might be a little more enticing than milk and bacon, though I do love bacon, as did medieval Irish monks, though they preferred theirs wild. At the monastery of Tulla, the monk Mulruin claimed that not a morsel of meat was eaten in Tulla in his lifetime, unless it were a deer or a wild pig. Another interesting tidbit that the monk gives on their eating, or rather drinking habits, was what they were drinking, but also how they were supposed to drink it. See, they usually drank either ale or this whey water, which was just watered down whey left over from the cheese making process. But in either case, they were instructed to sip it. For a man finds less sensual pleasure and satisfaction in sips when he is thirsty. So no gulping your whey water while you enjoy your wild pig. And wild animals were on the menu for a lot of people, not just monks. Pine marten, badger, and boar were some of the most popular, as were a number of fresh fish, lamprey, and shellfish. Though the fishing rights in rivers was very closely guarded, especially by the church, so be careful where you go fishing. There was also a great deal of hunting with birds of prey going on, but again, you gotta be careful where you do it. Stay away from any lands owned by the nobility or the church. You want to stick to the land of the commoners, because if you do catch something, then the owner of the land is due 1/5 of the meat and 2/5 of the feathers, but you get to keep everything else. That's not a bad deal. So all of these law books that talk about what people are allowed to eat had multiple purposes. One, of course, as I said, was to keep people on the social ladder, but another was to lay out what you had to give a person to eat if you injured them. Basically, if you hurt someone, you had to feed them until they got better. And what you had to feed them depended on who they were, and there's a lot of talk specifically about if they were women. In general, a woman got half of what her husband would get, and a concubine would only get 1/3 or even 1/4 of what whoever concubine she was got. And there were some women who, if they were injured, got nothing. These included a sharp-tongued woman, a vagrant woman, a werewolf in wolf's shape, an idiot, a lunatic. Big werewolf problem in medieval Ireland, huge. Now, if you were sick, there were also some foods that you had to stay away from. No salted meat, no honey, no whale meat, and no horse meat. The law also dictated how you were to feed a pregnant woman, or rather, it just dictated that you had to feed a pregnant woman. One set of laws makes it very clear that if your wife is pregnant, you have to feed her or else you will be fined. And speaking of pregnant women in Old Ireland, there is a story in the 10th century Life of St. Patrick where a pregnant woman becomes ill and Patrick asks her to diagnose herself. "Why are you ill?" he asks. The woman answered, "I beheld an herb in the air, and on earth I never saw its equal. And I shall die, or the child that is in my womb will die, or we shall both die unless I eat that herb." And just like husbands everywhere go out in the middle of the night to get pickles and watermelon for their pregnant wives, St. Patrick decided to placate the lady by magically turning the rushes into that herb, which, depending on the translation, is usually leeks or chives. Now, once a lady gave birth, then you would take care of the child for a while, usually about 7 years, and then you would give that child to another member of the clan that you were in to raise and educate. It was done as a way to keep the families close together. It was a system known as fosterage, and along with the child, you would send some cows. If you were a farmer, you would send 3 cows with your son or daughter, and if you were a king, up to 18 cows. These cows could then produce an income which would be used to take care of the child in fosterage and to feed the child. And of course, what the child was fed depended on who they were. The base diet for your average kid was known as the soft fare of fosterage and included the yolk of eggs, butter, curds, and gruel. Though again, not all the butter was equal. Common children got salted butter and noble children got fresh butter. They also usually got some honey. But fresh butter and honey was just the beginning for a noble child because once they grew up, things got real good. Instead of salted meat, nobles were due fresh meat, at least from Samhain to New Year's. The rest of the year, it was kind of a toss-up, usually salted meat, simply because cows with their milk-producing capabilities were so precious that you didn't turn them into meat until you absolutely had to, no matter who you were. But even if you did get salted meat, as a noble, you also got honey, fresh garlic, and an unlimited amount of celery. Now, just like peasants, nobles had a strict hierarchy as well that was also shown in the food. One would be simply how close to the king you got to sit when you were eating, and the other was the higher up on the nobility ladder you were, then the higher up on the cow your meat came from. A king might get rib or tenderloin, while the royal doorkeepers got flank and shank. Now, a fair amount of what we know about royal food at the time actually comes from this poem, the one that our corned beef description is from today. It's about a scholar named MacConglin who finds himself the guest of some monks in Cork, but the monks' hospitality is lacking. They give him a small cup of the church way water and 2 sparks of fire in the middle of a wisp of oaten straw and 2 sods of fresh peat. So naturally, he mocks this meager ration, and the monks, not ones to take criticism well, decide to crucify him for it. Literally crucify him. But the night before the crucifixion, he has a dream or a vision from God of a land filled with food. A boat formed of lard takes him across a lake of milk to where he sees a fort, with works of custards thick beyond the lock. Fresh butter was the bridge in front, the rubble dyke was wheaten white, bacon the palisade. The place was surrounded by streams of beer and mead, and there was even a well of wine. And he goes inside, and the columns are made of cheese, and all of the people are wearing cheese and tripe around their necks, and the king is wearing a mantle made of beef. And that king was Cathal Mac Finnegan. Well, the bloodthirsty monks realize that this vision somehow is what is going to cure the real king, Cathal Mac Finnegan, of the demon that's inside of him. The demon of gluttony. So they release MacConglin, and MacConglin goes to the king. But the king, only able to think about food, isn't paying attention to him, until finally MacConglin grinds his teeth against a stone so loudly that everyone, including the king, has no choice but to pay attention. And it reminds me of that scene in Jaws, where Quint scratches down the chalkboard. "I'll catch your gluttony for you, but it ain't gonna be easy. Bad demon. Not like going down to the pond and catching lust or envy." And it wasn't easy, because even after he got his attention, it took MacConglin a long time to get the king to even share an apple. But it was the first time that the king had shared any food in 3.5 years. The next step was to get him to fast for a couple days. And then he makes a huge feast with roast meat, and then ties the king to the wall and tells him about this vision of the land of food that he had. Until the lawless beast that abode in the inner bowels of Cathal Mac Finnegan came forth until it was licking his lips outside his head. Gluttony falls onto the ground and McConglin takes a cauldron and puts it over him and tells everyone to evacuate the castle. Then he lights the place on fire, but the demon escapes and goes up to the roof. But McConglin has one final trick up his sleeve. He reads the Gospels to the demon, and Gluttony goes to hell. So if you have any friends that are possessed of a demon, the first step is to get them to share an apple, then a couple days of fasting, and finally make them a wonderful dish of medieval corned beef and cabbage. So 30 minutes before your corned beef is done, open up the foil and then raise the temperature of the oven to 400 degrees Fahrenheit or about 205 Celsius just to let the top darken up a bit. And once it does, it and the cabbage are ready. And here we are, medieval corned beef and cabbage. It slices up so nice. Also, I wanted to thank Akiva from Metalwork by Mayola, who made me this gorgeous custom knife. He is a fan of the show and reached out and said, hey, do you want a wonderful custom knife? And I said yes, and he made it. It's amazing. It can cut pretty much everything. I think it's going to be my main knife from now on. And I'll put a link to his Instagram in the description if you want to check out what else he does or get yourself a custom knife. Now let's get to this corned beef. It smells delicious. I mean, it smells like corned beef, but that honey really, like, there's this almost burnt honey smell, but in a pleasant way. I'm excited to try it. Here we go. That's good. Super different from a modern corned beef because honey, I feel like, is not something that is usually mixed in with corned beef. So you get the saltiness of the corned beef, and a lot of times they'll add like brown sugar, but that has a very different flavor. This is honey and salt and corned beef. It's really wonderful, and the texture is fantastic. Just falls apart, kind of a little chew at the beginning, and then it really just falls apart. It's gonna be perfect for sandwiches this week. Now the cabbage. I mean, it's cabbage. It's not super complex, but it also has the leeks and the onion in there, which give it a little bit of heat. So it does kind of add some depth to it. But it's okay that it's not too complex because the meat is. So together they go really well. So whether you have medieval corned beef and cabbage or not, I hope you have a wonderful St. Paddy's Day. Make sure to follow me on Instagram, Tasting History with Max Miller, and I'll see you next time on Tasting History. There was a medieval proverb that said, "Winter eateth what summer groweth." And so to survive a medieval winter, people would have to stockpile the foods that they had growing in the summer. Then all winter long, they could make dishes like frumenti, a wheat porridge perfect for keeping away the cold. So thank you to Bombas for sponsoring this video as we try to survive a medieval winter, this time on Tasting History. Frumenti is one of those dishes that would have been eaten by all members of society, from a serf to a monk to the king himself. That said, there were definitely differences between the version served to a peasant and the one at a royal banquet. Now, both of them would have been a wheat or sometimes barley porridge mixed with egg and milk. But in some of the nicer recipes, you find a lot of spices or even sugar. Other recipes might include venison stock or even call for the dish to be served with a side of venison. There's even one recipe in the form of curry from England that calls for the frumenti to be served alongside porpoise. Definitely a dish reserved for royalty. But I'm not concerned with how the royals will survive winter. I trust they'll be just fine. I'm more concerned with how the average person would have eaten. And so I wanted to find a simple frumenti recipe, and I did so in the French cookbook Le Viandier de Thévent, written around the year 1300. It's for fomenter. Take wheat, prepare it, wash it very well, and cook it in water. When it is cooked, drain it. Take cow's milk and bring it to a boil, add the wheat, and boil it again, stirring frequently. Remove it from the fire, stir often, and add in plenty of beaten egg yolks. And it should not be too hot when they are added. Some people add spices, a little saffron and venison stock. It should be yellowish and quite thick. So even this recipe gives the option for a fancier frumenti, saying that it can be made with spices and venison stock, or saffron, though the saffron is actually just there to color it if the egg yolks don't do enough. That said, I'm guessing most peasants really didn't care what the color of the dish was in the end, so they probably wouldn't bother adding any saffron. They were more just concerned with keeping warm. So for this recipe, what you'll need is 1 cup or 200 grams of wheat berries, 1 cup or 235 milliliters whole milk or almond milk, Almond milk would have been used during fasting days and during Lent, which is mostly during the winter, so you can use almond milk, but if you do that, then you really shouldn't be using egg yolks. But I'm not making this during Lent, so I'm using regular milk and 3 egg yolks. Also a half teaspoon of salt and some optional saffron. Now, the French recipe does not actually mention salt, but it would have been commonly used at the time, and it is mentioned in a wonderful recipe from 1430 along with sugar, and my favorite thing about the recipe is that it's told like a poem. Colour it with saffron and salt it well, and serve it forth, sir, at the meal. With sugar candy thou mayest douse, if it be served in a great lord's house. Take black sugar for meaner men, beware therewith, for it will burn. So here again it says that if it is being made for a great lord, you can go ahead and add some sugar, or even black sugar, which is just a less refined version of sugar, if it is being served to meaner men or somebody with less wealth. But I'm not going to use any, but if you want to sweeten it up, then you can. It will still be historically accurate. So first, rinse the wheat and then drain it. Then bring a quart of water to a boil and add the wheat in. Let it return to a boil, then reduce the heat to a simmer, cover the pot, and leave it to simmer for another 30 minutes or until it's nice and soft. By this time, most of the water should have been absorbed, and any that hasn't been, you can drain off. Now, some recipes, like the one that calls for porpoise, has you add the egg yolks to the milk before heating the milk up. Now, you can add it later, like this recipe says, but you run the risk of having them curdle, or scramble basically, and you'll have scrambled eggs. That is not good. So if you want to mitigate that, then you should add the egg yolks to the milk right now. Just beat them and add them to the milk, as well as the salt. Also, if you do want to add some ground saffron to make it more colorful, then you can do so now. Either way, pour it into a small pot and set it over low heat and slowly bring it to a simmer. Again, you don't want to end up with scrambled eggs, so make sure you're doing a slow heating. Once it starts to steam, then add in the wheat and raise the temperature to medium and let it continue to come to a gentle boil, stirring it so it doesn't burn to the bottom of the pot as it thickens. And once it's thickened, it is ready to eat. And the original recipe does mention that it should be nice and thick. As my Nana would say, it should stick to your ribs. And it should do that because that way it'll stay with you, keep you warm through a medieval winter. There was a period from around the year 900 to 1300 where Europe was uncharacteristically warm, and they gave it the clever name of the medieval warm period. But starting around 1300, everything changed.
Winter is coming.
This was the beginning of what later would be more cleverly called the Little Ice Age. And while this period wouldn't see its coldest temperatures until around the 17th and 18th century, the 14th century kicked off with some wicked winters. In 1303, 1306, and 1307, much of the Baltic Sea froze over, and in the winter of 1363 to 64, there were long stretches of the Rhine River that froze solid for 2 months straight. And while you might expect that kind of weather in Northern Europe, Southern Europe also faced winter's wrath. In the winter of 1216, the Po River in Italy froze over solid, so much so that they were able to have a jousting tournament on it. And in February of 1352, the city of Florence in Italy was blanketed with snow for the entire month. A contemporary wrote that the snow rose to an extraordinary height, so to lighten up the roofs, the snow was thrown into the street, and some of the towns were blocked so the inhabitants were trapped for several days in their homes. I'm really hoping that that's not the case when I go to Florence next month, because I am not prepared for that kind of weather. Now, I'm sure that these harsh winters were hard on absolutely everyone, but there were some who were better prepared to handle them. I mean, a castle can be drafty, sure, but at least you have a raging fire in pretty much every room, tapestries on the walls to hold in the warmth, and of course, plenty of warm clothing to wear. Now, often this disparity, of course, had to do with money, but sometimes it was simply because of your social status. Regardless of if you could afford it or not, you weren't allowed to wear certain types of clothing. In the sumptuary laws from England in 1363, there were rules set in place that said that certain types of fabric, as well as certain types of fur, or sometimes fur at all, could not be worn by the majority of society, regardless of if they could actually afford it or not. But winter wasn't just about keeping warm, but keeping fed. That same year that the jousting tournament took place on the frozen Po River, an Italian chronicler wrote that it was so cold that bread, apples, and pears, and all manner of food froze solid, and it could not be cut or eaten until they had been warmed up and thawed out by a fire. They even said that the wine froze in the casks, and to get it out they had to hack at it with an axe. When rivers froze, especially in areas that were unaccustomed to that kind of weather, it made distributing the food that they did have very difficult, as much of the food would have gone by boat down those rivers. In addition, the freezing would damage the watermills, which in the medieval period were numerous, and this meant that grain couldn't be ground into flour, so instead of bread, you had to eat something like the frumenti that we're making today. But while there were those who were caught unawares by the cold, most people took heed of the words of House Stark and knew that winter was coming, and so they would prepare during the warmer months to last out the winter. They would stockpile their wheat and barley, and to protect it from rodents and from the damp, they would first lay down a layer of gorse or another thorny plant on the floor of the barn, and this kept the grain raised off the wet floor, and the thorns made it more difficult for vermin to come up through the boards. Now, when it came to meat, you would pretty much not be eating anything fresh. The summer and fall were the time to fatten the livestock, and then come November, it was time to slaughter them. For many people, the festival of Martinmas on November 11th was one of the last big feasts of the year that would include fresh beef. Once everyone had had their fill, then everything else was going to be saved for winter. And this is where they really excelled at preparation, because pretty much all parts of the animal could be preserved. Certain organ meat would be pickled, while the blood would be made into blood sausages and black puddings, which, when kept cool, could last for months. Then the majority of the meat was destined to be either dried, smoked, or salted. Meat could be made into sausages and then hoisted over smoking fires. Often you could just hang them in the rafters of your own house, because even though you would have a hole in the roof to let the smoke out from the fire, it was still pretty filled with smoke up in the rafters, because the chimney had been invented, but it was mostly in just a handful of stone buildings at this time. So the roof was pretty much filled with smoke, which was great for smoking sausages. Brilliant. But the majority of the meat was destined for being brined or salted. They would either brine the meat or in addition to that, pack it tightly in salt and store it for months or sometimes even longer. The great news was that it would last throughout the winter. The bad news was that all your meat was really salty and really tough. And this is why, especially during the winter, everything was boiled. During the summer, you might see fresh meat being roasted, but mostly during the winter, it had to be boiled for a few hours before just to make it edible. It was not uncommon, even during the summer, to boil meat before roasting it, because medieval Europe just loved boiled meat. Now, some cows, along with some goats and sheep, would be kept back to make more cows, goats, and sheep the next year, as well as to provide the house with milk, butter, and cheese. Butter and cheese being an excellent way to preserve the milk, but again, it would have been very, very salted at this period, both the butter and the cheese. Most of the animals, though, were slaughtered come November, though there were two that got a month of reprieve: geese and pigs. And this was because once fall hit, you didn't have to feed them anymore. Instead, they were allowed to gorge themselves on worms and acorns until December. But come December, they too were destined for the butcher block, which is why in many calendars from the medieval period, December includes images of pigs being slaughtered. Pork was a very important meat for most people to see them through the winter, because frankly, most people didn't have access to cows because they were very, very expensive. Pigs, on the other hand, most people could afford to keep at least a few around. But keeping them around through winter, well, that was a different story, because every pig was just another mouth to feed, and so most of them were destined to become salt pork or bacon before Christmas. But what about fish, you may ask? Surely everyone could just go catch some fish in a stream or a pond throughout the winter, right? Well, no. In many places, the common peasant was actually forbidden to fish no matter the time of year. If you lived on a lord's land, and pretty much everyone lived on a lord's land because that's kind of how feudalism worked, then it would be up to that lord if he would allow you to fish in his ponds, rivers, and streams, and the vast majority said no. There were a handful of estates during the Middle Ages that did allow their tenants to fish at will in their streams and whatnot, but that was the exception and not the rule. Now, if you did happen to live near the ocean, well, that was pretty much fair game for the most part, but fishing on the ocean during the winter was pretty dangerous, namely because of the weather. But just because you didn't get fresh fish during the winter, that doesn't mean you didn't get any fish, because just like the meat, you could have preserved fish. Herring, for example, were often salted or pickled and could be kept through the winter and sold to those living inland, and then there were the infamous stockfish, which was usually made of cod. Stockfish was not salted, but dried and cured in a process of fermentation. This fish could last for years and years on end, but it was so hard and dried that it had to be beaten with a mallet, kind of like hardtack. Then once it was softened up, it usually had to be boiled just like the salted meat for a very long time just to make it edible. In the book of Marjorie Kemp from the early 15th century, she tells a story of Jesus coming to her and saying, "Thou shalt be eaten and gnawed by the people of the world, as any rat gnaweth the stockfish. Daughter, for you are so buxom to my will, and cling as sore unto me as the skin of stockfish clings to a man's hands when it is boiled." Lovely, really paints a picture. Though I actually really want to try stockfish and I want to actually make it. Requires a lot of planning, but maybe that's an upcoming long-term project for the channel. Now, surviving a winter during the Middle Ages did mean mostly a diet of dried and preserved foods, but there were some fresh, or at least non-preserved foods that you could eat. Things like chestnuts, walnuts, almonds, and hazelnuts were typically eaten throughout the winter and were especially important during Lent. This 40-day period during the winter meant a complete abstention from meat, eggs, and dairy. Now, the meat part wasn't so hard because a lot of people had actually eaten through most of their meat by the time Mardi Gras came around. But the dairy was a little bit harder because milk was used in a lot of dishes and a lot of cooking during the period, so they would have to make almond milk or hazelnut milk, and they're actually made pretty much the same way that they're done today, though some were made with water, but many times, instead of water, it would be made with beer or wine. Another fresh item that you might eat would be a fresh fruit or vegetable on occasion. Most, of course, would be long gone or else dried to within an inch of its life by now, but things like apples and pears were often able to last into the cold of February, and vegetables such as cabbages and leeks were commonly grown and harvested throughout even the snowiest months. Then there were radishes, which according to the 13th century scholar Bartholomeus Anglicus, or Bartholomew the Englishman, were most important to eat during the winter. See, medicine was still based on the idea of the four humors, which were kept in balance partly by eating foods designated hot, cold, wet, and dry. Well, the ravages of winter, which was considered to be wet and cold, could be combated with a hot, dry food, which radishes were considered. Heat burns in the fat matter of the root. In winter, it is a reservoir of heat, and gathers itself to another and is multiplied. So to survive a medieval winter, it was all about preparation, gathering up enough food that it could see you through those coldest months, because most people did not have the ability to buy a lot of food. But if you lived in a city or even a large town, you might not have the space to store all of that food or even grow it in the first place, so you were going to have to buy your food, and it was going to cost you. Except for those few items with government price controls, namely ale and bread, all other food prices rose during the winter. For instance, should you find yourself having to travel and stay the night at an inn, you would have to pay not only for your own food, but also that of the horse you rode in on, supposing you weren't on foot. Well, in the 1340s in England, stabling your horse for the night and having them fed would cost about 1.5 pennies during the summer and 3.5 during the winter. And not only did food prices rise during the winter, but your wages actually shrank. Winter meant that there were fewer hours in the day, and this meant that your daily wages would be cut. For instance, in London in the 1340s, a tiler, that is someone who made floor tiles and roof tiles, would earn 5.5 pennies in the summer, but only 4.5 during the winter. So between the rise in prices and the cut in pay, the average city dweller during the period could spend over 70% of their income just on food. And there is a wonderful quote from Bartholomew the Englishman about this. It's actually about plants and whatnot growing, but it works with your savings as well. He says that all things that lived and sprang by the benefit of summer fade and die by the hard cruelness of winter. And that's why instead of some succulent chicken or spiced roast pork for this winter episode, I decided to make this simple porridge for a medieval peasant. And here we are, frumenti from the 14th century. So it does have this yellowness to it, which I kind of love. And you could have made it even more yellow with more saffron or more egg yolks. Here we go. Interesting. Now, does it need sugar and spices? I think it would really help, but it's actually much more flavorful than I had expected because of the eggs. Because the wheat, kind of bland. but the eggs add this like richness to it. So I can see why it would be a lot more filling than just something like oatmeal. There is, I mean, it's like packed with calories. So probably a much smaller bowl would do. So it's actually really good. And I can see that this would keep you warm and full all day long, no matter what, really. I also really love the texture. It's not mushy. The wheat berries have kind of held themselves together, and so each one kind of like pops in your mouth, I guess. Like they're soft enough to eat, but not so soft that they become just mush. I actually kind of like that. I would probably add a little sugar or some cinnamon or other spices that they would have been using at the time. But yeah, it's actually better than I had expected. So make some frumenti, keep warm, and I will see you next time on Tasting History.
Let's imagine you're a medieval traveler heading out on a long journey. Where are you gonna stay? How are you gonna get there? And most importantly, what are you gonna eat? Because medieval drive-thrus are not really a thing. So I suggest you bring something with you. Something like this 14th century recipe for pine nut and ginger candy called pain ragoon. So thank you to David Protein for sponsoring this video as we make the food of a medieval traveler. This time on Tasting History. People in the Middle Ages actually traveled a lot more than we typically think, whether it was just to the nearest market town, which could still be a few days away, or maybe they were going on pilgrimage to someplace like Canterbury, Santiago de Compostela, or as far away as Jerusalem. But regardless of where or why you were traveling, the food along the way could be rather inconsistent, and so there are a lot of texts from the period that say to bring some for yourself. Now today when I go on a road trip, I get Doritos and peanut M&Ms, but those were not options in the Middle Ages, so we have to look at documents like the Canterbury Tales, where travelers stuffed their packs with things like little meat pies and cakes. Then there's a Spanish text from the early 16th century where a notary named Juan Velez stocked up on candy, specifically marzipan and a nougat of nuts and honey similar to modern turron. And these were perfect because they were small and portable, but also they wouldn't spoil quickly. So since I am a fan of candy, I have gone with a candy recipe, which comes from the English cookbook The Forma of Curry, compiled around 1390, and is for pain ragoon. Take honey and sugar of Cyprus and clarify them together and boil it with easy fire, and keep it well from burning, and when it hath boiled a while, take up a drop thereof with the finger, and do it in a little water, and look if it hangs together. And take it from the fire, and do thereto pine nuts the thridendella, and powdered ginger, and stir it together till it begin to thicken, and cast it on a wet table. Cut it in strips, and serve forth with fried meat on flesh days or on fish days. So this is either going to be like a pine nut brittle or something softer like a pine nut nougat, just depending on how hot we decide to get the sugar. Also, this is just one of many of these types of recipes. They're in all sorts of old cookbooks, and sometimes they will use different nuts or thicken the nougat with things like breadcrumbs, or in one case, in a 15th century recipe called pinade, with chicken. They added chicken to the candy, so it's sugar and ginger and pine nuts and chicken. And while that sounds absolutely awful, it would at least add a lot of protein to your candy, and you do want a lot of protein when you're traveling. So if you want, you can add some chicken. Some medieval pine nut candy without chicken, so I'm going to start making that right now. So what you'll need is 2/3 of a cup or 200 grams of honey, 1 cup or 200 grams of white sugar. And we know it's white sugar because it says that it should be sugar of Cyprus. And at this time, the island of Cyprus was really the only place in the West where they were refining sugar from Asia down into something that was white, similar-ish to the sugar that we know today. Then 1½ cups or 200 grams of pine nuts. Also, when the recipe mentions the pine nuts, it does so in conjunction with the word thridendella, which comes from like the third deal or the third portion. And exactly what it means in this context is up for some debate. But many people, including myself, believe that it is referring to the amount of pine nuts, sugar, and honey all being the same. Like, it's the third portion. The thing is, it doesn't say if it's the same by weight or by volume, and those things are very, very different. So I went by weight because that's just what I went with. Then 1½ teaspoons of powdered ginger. So start by toasting your pine nuts, and you can leave them raw, but toasting them in a dry pan for a couple of minutes will really help to bring out their flavor. Just make sure you don't burn them. Also, the recipe isn't clear if the pine nut should be whole or ground up in the candy. There are other recipes for candy where they're whole, and there are others like marzipan where they are ground up, so I'm splitting the difference and doing half ground and then half whole. Then add the sugar and the honey to a saucepan and stir them together, and then set this over a medium-low heat. And you don't want to rush heating this as it will easily burn. As it does heat, the sugar will melt into the honey and you can give it another stir to make sure the two ingredients are well combined, and then just let it continue to heat, not stirring it, until it gets to the desired temperature. Now, what that temperature is kind of up to you. The recipe says that what you're looking for is a certain texture, a way that the sugar is going to act, by saying to take up a drop thereof with the finger and do it in a little water and look if it hangs together. Do not do this. Do not take your finger and put it into molten sugar. You will burn yourself. That's absolutely crazy. But you can actually test the doneness of sugar or the approximate temperature by dropping it into water using a spoon, not your finger, and seeing how it reacts. The thing is, it just says until it hangs together. But exactly what that means is unclear. I feel like that could be anything from the hard ball stage to the hard crack stage, which is like a 60-degree Fahrenheit difference. Personally, I kind of went in between and went for the soft crack stage, which is when it hits between 270 and 290 degrees Fahrenheit, 132 to 143 Celsius, and that should give us a nice firm but still chewy texture to the candy. But you could also make more like a hard brittle candy by taking it up to the hard crack stage, which is 300 to 310 degrees Fahrenheit or about 150 Celsius. Whichever you choose, when it gets to the desired temperature, you want to remove it from the heat and immediately add in the ground nuts and stir them in, and then add the ginger and mix that until it is fully dispersed, and then lastly, you can add the whole nuts. Then pour this out onto a piece of parchment paper or aluminum foil, and it should spread out on its own, but since we're going to cut them into strips, it helps to guide the mixture into a square or rectangle shape. You could also put it in a mold if you really want straight lines. As it is, I'm just kind of doing my best, but it sort of did its thing, and you know what? Good for it. Then you want to let it cool for just a few minutes before cutting it into strips. You can't let it cool completely or it does become very hard to cut, especially if you go with the hard crack stage. So you just kind of have to figure it out and cut it when it's cuttable. Then before I actually try this confection of the Middle Ages, I wanted to ask you to like this video and subscribe to Tasting History. It does help the channel a lot, and it helps to push these videos out to more tastorians so they too can learn more about what you should eat on a medieval journey. During the Middle Ages, people traveled for all sorts of reasons. Merchants traveled trading and selling goods, and common people traveled to market towns to buy those goods. Messengers crisscrossed the continent delivering messages, and monks, priests, and friars journeyed on religious work. Knights and mercenaries traveled off to war, while diplomats visited courts to keep the peace. And countless people of all classes went on pilgrimage, either as an act of religious devotion or as a medieval form of tourism. But whatever your reason for traveling, you really had to plan ahead. And your first question to answer was, how am I going to get to where I am going? Now, the three main options are either by boat, by horse, or on foot, and sometimes it was a combination of all three. Now, boats were definitely the fastest, especially if you were crossing an ocean or on a navigable river. But sometimes you need to get between two places where it's just land, and so you have to go by land, and the fastest way usually would be by horse. But it's also the most expensive way. Because yes, you might be able to travel 30 or 40 miles a day, but you, one, had to have a horse, and two, had to feed and stable that horse. A document from 1331 shows that a party of 7 people, 3 merchants and 4 servants, paid 10 pence just on fodder for their horses for one night. That was almost as much as they paid for all of their own food, which was 5.5 pence on meat, 4 pence on bread, 2 pence on ale, 1 and a farthing on wine, and another farthing on some stew. Now, considering a tradesman only made about 2 pence per day, that was a lot of money to spend on food and on horse fodder. Add to that the fact that sometimes traveling by horse was no faster than traveling by foot because you were often going in a group with some people who were walking, or you were burdening down your horse with all of your stuff, and so they just couldn't go any faster than a person could. Like in 1297, Margaret, the Duchess of Brabant, moved her clothes from London to her new home in the Netherlands, and she put her wardrobe in a cart pulled by 5 horses, and it took 18 days to travel just the first leg of the journey from London to Ipswich. 85 miles in 18 days. That's less than 5 miles a day. So provided you don't have to move a wardrobe, your best bet is probably going to be to travel by foot. Records show that most travelers on foot covered 15 miles a day, with some covering up to 30. That is 3 miles an hour for 10 hours a day, but people did it. Of course, it speeds things up if you are walking on a well-maintained road, and a lot of the roads in medieval Europe were not well-maintained, especially the smaller ones. There are actually stories about puddles, like potholes in the roads being so deep that people would drown. In England, they actually had to put in a law saying that you could not dig a well in the middle of a road. Who would do that? I don't know, but they had a law saying not to do it because travelers would come up and just think it was a puddle and then sink to the bottom of the well and die. But there were also some very well-maintained roads. These were usually the roads going in and out of towns and large cities, especially connecting the two, or some of the old Roman roads were still maintained. Like in England, this was places like Icknield Way, Fosse Way, and Watling Street. They were the Roman roads that still linked places that people actually wanted to go. But what you really wanted to travel on were the king's roads, and these were the roads that the king used to get around the country. So he needed to be able to go fast, and he needed to be able to go safely. In 1285, King Edward I decreed, "It is commanded that highways leading from one market town to another shall be enlarged, so that there be neither dyke, underwood, nor bush whereby a man may lurk to do hurt, within 200 feet of the one side and 200 feet on the other side." Basically, more than the width of a football field on either side of the road had to be completely cleared, except for large oak trees. Those were fine to leave. They had to be cleared so that robbers and stuff couldn't lurk and just jump out and steal all your stuff. And so what was going to be safer was if you were traveling in a group and not sleeping beside the road. People were not often just camping along the roads. They went and stayed at friends' houses or in the barn of a hospitable farmer, or most comfortably at an inn or monastery. When it comes to inns, these ranged from dirt cheap and kind of nasty to really expensive and very, very nice. They were basically just like the hotels that we have today, and they often were going to serve you some food. So you would get a room, or at least a place in the corner where you could sleep, and then a hot meal. Sometimes a cold meal, but sometimes a hot meal, whether it was a meat pie or fried rissoles or a bowl of perpetual stew. This was the stew that was just kind of always going, and when it was going low, then they would just add more ingredients, and it could go on for centuries. Then there were some inns where the meal that was served was quite nice. Like in the 1330s, a merchant named John de Villers traveled through England and mentioned several meals, including one in Leicester where he was served bread, ale, and herrings, and then he had a particularly fine supper in Nottingham where they served him eels and flounder served with garlic and onions, as well as some fresh fruit. Also, when he was in Nottingham, he used it as an opportunity to get some ingredients that I guess he couldn't get back in his hometown. So he spent 18 pence on buying almonds and sugar and ginger and rice. But 3 of those things is basically what you need to make the dish that we're making today. Pine nuts instead of almonds, but close enough. Of course, he was traveling in England, in his home country, so he knew the cuisine well, and he knew that it wouldn't upset his stomach. But there were times when people traveled internationally, and so they had to beware of the changes in diet and how it affected them. Even today, when you travel internationally, sometimes the food can disagree with you. And so, just like today, there were actually travel guides that were written that told people how to make sure that they stayed healthy when traveling internationally. Now, some of these guides would just say, take all of your own food and drink lots of aquavitae, the water of life, basically distilled grain alcohol. But that's impractical. 1, to bring all of your own food, and 2, the aquavitae was not terribly common then in the Middle Ages like it is now. You can't just go get a bottle of vodka. More practical was something like the Codex Calixtinus, which was a 12th century text written for those going on pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela, one of the more popular pilgrimage sites in Europe. The author maps out your journey through most of France and then through Spain and tells you all of the streams and rivers that you'll come up to and says if you can drink out of it or not. And many of the inns and taverns along the way, he says, you know, this person gives good food, this one, I wouldn't trust him, I wouldn't eat there. It was basically the Michelin guide of the 12th century, except the writing is so much more interesting than any tire company could come up with. In Spain and Galicia, don't eat the fish called a barbus, or any eel or tench, because without doubt you will immediately die or fall very sick. If by luck anyone eats and doesn't get sick, they're healthier than most or have stayed longer in the country. For all fish, beef and pork in Spain and Galicia make foreigners ill. In Gascony, on the other hand, he says that the food is wonderful, even if he's not a fan of the people that live there. Gascony, with its white bread and the best and reddest wine. And the people? Fast-talking, obnoxious, and sex-crazed. They are overfed, poorly dressed drunks. They all sit around the fire rather than eating at a table and drink from one cup. Now, another caution when eating at an inn is to make sure that you can see the kitchen and see who is actually cooking your food, because there are those who would do you harm. There is a medical treatise from 1370 by John Ardern, and it's actually a treatise on how to treat hemorrhoids and other issues down there, but in it he talks about a concoction, a potion that you can give to someone basically if you're going to perform surgery on them. He says it's a powder for to make a man sleep against his will, that he shall not feel whatsoever is done to him. Now this makes sense for a medical text, but then he also says that it's the kind of thing that you could give to a pilgrim at an inn, that they may rob them of their silver when they are asleep. Why would you say that? Why would you include that in a medical text? You've basically just given a medieval recipe for roofies. Why would you do that? So, it just gives you another reason to travel in a group or stay somewhere safe like a monastery. And medieval monasteries were set up for hospitality. In fact, it was part of their rule. The rule of Saint Benedict was to welcome in visitors. Let all guests that come be received like Christ, for he will say, I was a stranger, and ye took me in. And let fitting honor be shown to all, especially to those who are of the household of the faith, and to pilgrims. And it's true that they were particularly welcoming to men of the cloth and to people who were on pilgrimage. In fact, there were some monasteries that were actually the goal of the pilgrimage. For example, the abbey at Cluny had a vast collection of religious relics, like a supposed fragment of the true cross, John the Baptist's tooth, and the ashes of both St. Peter and Paul. All items that would have been on a medieval pilgrim's bucket list. Also, when you got there, the first day they gave you a pound of bread and a portion of wine to drink. The second day, you got a half portion and a half pound of bread. It was kind of their way of gently nudging you along your way, I guess. But when you did finally leave, they gave you a penny, kind of as a souvenir. Now, you could only do this once a year. They did keep track, so you couldn't just keep coming back and getting more pennies. But still, you get a night or two of good food and a safe place to sleep and a penny. Can't complain. Though a lot of the abbeys did, if not require, then at least appreciate and expect a donation, but still it was probably cheaper than staying at an inn. Now, there were monasteries all over Europe at this time, and they were often placed on the paths of pilgrims, so you could, in theory, just go from monastery to monastery. But if your plan was to go to Jerusalem, the Super Bowl of pilgrimages, then at some point you probably were going to need to get onto a boat. And during the Middle Ages, boats were not as comfortable as a monastery. In the 15th century, the Englishman William Way went on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, and he wrote about his experience along with some do's and don'ts. Many of these do's and don'ts had to do with food, things that you should be taking along with you and things that you shouldn't be taking along with you. He also says that when you arrive in Venice, which is where most of the boats left from, that you should buy all of this stuff. He gives a whole packing list. When you leave Venice, you should have confections, laxatives, restoratives, ginger, rice, figs, raisins, great and small, pepper, saffron, cloves, mace, and powdered douce. Also take with you a little cauldron and frying pan, dishes, platters, saucers of wood, cups of glass, a grater for bread, and such necessaries. Also buy a cage for half a dozen of hens or chicken to have with you in the galley, and buy you half a bushel of millet seed for them. You may buy eggs when on land for cheap, and they can be fried in olive oil or prepared for a caudle. A caudle being a warm drink often thickened with egg yolks, and it was very often thickened wine, and wine does seem to be the drink of choice, at least for William Way. He says you should buy 3 10-gallon barrels, and 2 of these barrels shall serve for wine and the third for water. In the 1 barrel take red wine and keep it until you return from the Holy Land, because it is good for the flux. The flux being dysentery, and yeah, international travel, especially back then, was likely to give you some dysentery. But to ward off the collywobbles, he says that there are certain foods you should bring with you, just in case you can't find proper food to eat when you're there. You must take biscuit with you, for while you may dine at the table with your patron, oft-time you will snack on your own bread, cheese, eggs, fruit, bacon, and wine. Also, sometimes you shall have feeble bread, wine, and stinking water, so you will be full glad to eat of your own. Another traveler to the Holy Land, Friar Felix Fabry, try saying that 5 times fast, he suggests that, yeah, most of the food that you're going to eat is probably stuff that you needed to bring yourself. Suggesting 2 jars of the best wine and a big bag with the best fish, smoked meats, cheese, oil, rice, almonds, raisins, big and small, vinegar, salt, and a good supply of other necessaries. And above all, huge quantities of biscuit, having been instructed already that biscuit was a kind of desert currency. Biscuit in this case being hardtack. And while that may be a practical food to bring along with you on your journey, it's not the most delicious, so if you are heading out onto that medieval road, might I suggest packing up your bag filled with meat pies, some cakes, cheese, and a nice stack of pain ragoon, like the ones that I'm about to eat right now. And here we are, a 14th century recipe for pain ragoon, or pine nut candy, perfect for a medieval road trip. So here it is. Now, this is not the brittle form. This one is a little bit softer, but it still does break, but it's very, very sticky. If you take it all the way to the brittle form, to like 300 degrees Fahrenheit, 310, it'll be a little less sticky and more snap. It does snap, but there is still some bend to it. Let's give it a taste. Oh, really, really good. It's really, really chewy though. I'm gonna be here for a minute. So my first thing is, it's fantastic. The flavor is wonderful. The fact that there is the honey and the sugar gives it such a more depth of flavor than if it was just sugar. The pine nuts are definitely the first thing that you taste. That's the dominant flavor. And you don't taste any ginger until the very end. And like, as you finish the candy, the ginger comes in, and it's not super strong. It's not like a ginger candy or anything like that. It's really, really nice. The texture is crunchy and yet chewy at the same time, which is interesting. And it does get stuck in your teeth. I think if you did brittle, it wouldn't get stuck in your teeth as much, or it would just be more of the crunchy and less of the chewy. So it's really just kind of up to you which one you want. But it's really, really good. I do think that you do kind of need to wrap each one individually because they are so sticky, they will stick to each other. So, you know, kind of wrap each one in a little piece of paper or whatever. But yeah, they're easy to make. They're really, really good. You could also add different spices. Some of the other recipes I've seen have some cinnamon or galangal or grains of paradise pepper. So you can kind of just play around and add whatever spices you want. You can change the nuts to almonds or hazelnut or whatever you want. Yeah, they're fantastic. I could definitely see this, you know, going down the road, just wanting to chew on something, and yeah, I might make these. Like, this is something I would just make because that's how good they are. So make some medieval candy, head down the road on a medieval road trip, and I will see you next time on Tasting History. To paraphrase The Sound of Music, how do you solve a problem like a medieval knight who won't stop killing people? One answer is a tournament. And today we'll cook something that might have been served to Sir Pellinore just before a joust. Chutes on Flesh Day, or meat pies. So thank you to Porter Road for sponsoring this video as we make a medieval meal to go, this time on Tasting History. So there are lots of recipes for these little pies, and they're all a little bit different, so I'm actually going to be pulling from several medieval recipes, but the one that I'm reading is from the Liber Curae Cocurum from 1430, and I'm doing it because it's a poem. Take liver of pork and carve it small, for a pie be hewn it shall, and hens therewith do all in a pan, and fry it well as thou well can. Make a coffin as for a small pie, and that therein, and yolks thereby of hard eggs boiled, and also thou take powder of ginger and salt to bake. Carve it and fry it in grease full good, well pinched served at last by the rood. Here ends our cookery that I have spake, of pottage, haslets, and meat I bake, and sauce thereto, without lying, Christ must our souls to heaven bring. So, a meat pie with pork and chicken. Though there are also recipes that call for veal or other types of beef, some with fish that are meant to be eaten during Lent, and others that are sweet pies with fruit, though the fruit would be cooked, for in the words of the Book of Carving from 1500, beware of green salads and raw fruits, for they will make your sovereign sick. Though there is one recipe for salad from the form of curry, so clearly not everyone took that to heart. Now, like I said, there are lots of other recipes, and several of them say that you can use any piece of pork, rather than this one which specifies pork liver. Well, I don't like pork liver, so I'm going to follow one of those other period recipes and use just some other cuts of pork, though even these cuts are a little odd. They're interesting cuts like pork wings and pork neck that I got from our sponsor, Porter Road. Now, I often do recipes here on the show that call for, shall we say, intimidating cuts of meat, and they can be really hard to find even at most butcher shops. But Porter Road is an online butcher based in Tennessee that can supply both traditional cuts like pork chops or chicken breast, but also those interesting cuts like Merlot steak or pork wings. And I love them because they work with local farmers who pasture raise their animals and practice responsible animal husbandry, which actually affects the quality and the flavor of the meat. And you can order individual cuts online, or you can sign up for a subscription and the meat arrives fresh direct to your door. In addition to the pork wings and the pork neck, I got some pork chops, which I had for dinner just last night. They were so tender and flavorful that other than a little bit of salt and some butter, they didn't need anything else to be absolutely the bee's knees, or in this case, the pork's chop. And since you're watching Tasting History with Max Miller, you get 15% off of your first order by clicking the link in the description, and you get free shipping on any orders over $100. Now that we know where our meat came from, let's figure out exactly how much we need for these chutes on Flesh Day. 1 pound or 450 grams of pork. Like I said, I'm using pork wings and pork neck, but any cut will do, and that goes the same for the 1/2 pound or 225 grams of chicken. 5 hard-boiled egg yolks, 1 teaspoon ground ginger, and 1½ teaspoons of salt. So cut up your pork and chicken and set them in a pan to fry. You want to have it completely cooked through, and that's going to depend on how small you made your pieces, but probably 4 to 5 minutes to make sure that everything is done. Also, you want the pieces to be rather small because it's going to be easier to put them into your pie. Then put the cooked meat in a bowl and mash your egg yolks and add them to the meat. Then add the ginger and the salt, and mix everything together. Now, when it comes to the pastry, it's really up to you what you want to use. There was no standard for something like this in medieval England. They used everything from very bland, just water and flour. You weren't really supposed to eat it, it was just a holder, to kind of fancier pastries that would have had egg yolks and butter or milk in them. Now, they didn't have puff pastry, but I'll tell you, it actually works really well for these, so you can use that. What I'm going to be using is something akin to a hot water crust pastry, but frankly, it's even easier to make. You need 3 cups or 400 grams of flour, a 1/2 cup or 113 grams of butter, 2/3 cup or about 150 grams of lard, and 1/3 cup or 80 milliliters of boiling water. So make a well in the center of the flour and add the lard and the butter, then pour the boiling water over it. Then, using a fork, work the fat and flour together. If it's not forming a dough, then just add a little bit more water. Once it does form a dough, set it out on a lightly floured surface and use your fingers or the heel of your palm to kind of smear the fat in through the dough until well incorporated. Then let it rest for a while, either in the refrigerator, or you can just leave it out for 20 or 30 minutes until it comes to room temperature. At this point, take small pieces and roll them into rounds, and then set a bit of meat in the center of the dough and fold it over to create a pie, crimping the edges. Depending on the size of pie that you're making, it should make about 12. Now it comes to cooking them, and for this I'm going to have you join me over at camera 2. So, I guess we don't have a camera 2. Oh, and there's nobody else here, so I'm just talking to myself, but that's okay because we need to talk. It is important to stay humble. Remember, Caesar, thou art mortal, and today I was reminded that I art mortal. The recipe that I tried to follow says to fry these, and I tried to fry them. I tried 3 different doughs. I had different types of fat at different temperatures. I've fried things before, and it's worked. But today, my kitchen was like, no, you are going to fail at every attempt that you make, and you just have to be okay with that. So after some hours of frustration and despair, I decided to bake them. And that is okay, because in 2 other recipes from the 2 15th century cookbooks, it does call for them to be baked. But I did try to fry them, so I failed. And that's okay. So while I encourage you to try to fry them, if you want to bake them like I did, put on a nice egg wash and then pop them in an oven at 400 degrees Fahrenheit or 200 degrees Celsius for about 20 minutes. Now while those bake and you leave me a comment of support, or more likely a comment letting me know what I did wrong, let's escape to medieval Europe, where the nobility and the church were having just as much trouble taming their knights as I did taming these pies. There's an old saying, an idle mind is the devil's workshop. Well, an idle knight would spend a lot of time in said workshop. So it was important to keep them busy. See, early on in the medieval period, a knight's job was destruction, and in the 10th and 11th century, especially in that part of Europe that had been the Carolingian Empire, they took that job very seriously. There were constant private wars being fought between minor lords, and when there was a break in the fighting, these knights tended to practice on the peasantry and the church, easy targets, I suppose. So in an attempt to curb the rampant violence, the church introduced the Pax et Treuga Dei, or Peace and Truce of God. The Peace of God was first proclaimed in 989, and it sought to protect church property and unarmed clerics. A general agreement that I will not infringe on the church in any way, I will not hurt a cleric or a monk if unarmed, I will not steal an ox, cow, pig, sheep, goat, ass, or a mare with a colt. Not much help for the little guy, but at least the bishop's cows were safe. However, it was expanded when Robert II of France agreed not to ransom servants or merchants or to root up fines. Nor would he burn a house down unless there was a knight inside. I will not attack noble ladies traveling without husband, nor their maids, nor widows or nuns unless it is their fault. From the beginning of Lent to the end of Easter, I will not attack an unarmed knight. Kind of implies that he had been doing these things. Now the church took that last part, not attacking a knight during Lent, and expanded it into the Treuga Dei, or the Truce of God, in 1027. This put a lot more restraints on the timing of violence. No violence at all during Lent or on Sundays or during Pentecost. And at certain times, battling could only take place Wednesday through Saturday. Seems sensible. Now, between the Peace of God and the Truce of God, you'd think that a lot of things got better, but you'd be wrong. Because while some people followed these edicts, most people did not. It tended to be a case of, what, are you going to excommunicate all of us? And the answer tended to be no. So the next ploy to curb violence in Western Europe was just to move it a few thousand miles to the east. It was called the First Crusade. Now there were a lot of reasons for the Crusades, and it's a far more complicated topic than we're going to talk about here. But one reason was to occupy the ever-fighting knights of Europe, and it worked. At least until they got back. But once they did get back, there was a new way to control their behavior called chivalry, coming from the Old French chevalerie, or horse soldiery. Now what was chivalry exactly? Because it wasn't always the pious and virtuous ideal set out by late medieval and Victorian authors. Sometimes it was, or at least that was the goal, but not always. And one of my favorite YouTubers, Shadiversity, does an excellent video on the intricacies and misconceptions of chivalry, so I'll put a link to that in the description, but essentially it was a code of conduct. But it wasn't always the same code of conduct for everyone. See, everyone had their own idea of what would make a knight chivalrous under any given circumstance. An extreme example might be that Archbishop Thomas Becket's idea of chivalry might be a knight's devotion to the church, a true miles Christi, or knight of Christ. But Henry II's ideal was that a knight should have 100% loyalty to their lord. And so when he orders a knight to go kill the archbishop, those two concepts are in conflict. And that kind of conflict actually probably happened a lot, but it was a good way to control your knight. So, between the peace of God, the truce of God, the Crusades, and the ever-evolving code of chivalry, there was actually a lot less fighting, at least in comparison with previous centuries. But when there is no fighting, what's a knight to do? For that which ceases from use has prepared the way for its own retirement. We knights are being kept from action like unskilled clodhoppers. This long interval of sitting around which prevents the practice of knightly exercise gives one kidney stones. But the lords of northern France and eventually of all Europe had an answer.
Tournament.
The recreation of a tournament is healthy and delightful, and it is held among knights for good reason, since those who are fit to be called to a tournament in time of peace will be all the more able to withstand enemies in war. Though when these tournaments first started around the end of the 11th century, they were brutal. They were a far cry from the archery and blunt jousting tournaments of later centuries. It was basically a mock battle on horseback called a melee, and the idea was to knock your opponent off of their horse. But instead of a gentlemanly, here, old chum, better luck next time, as you help them to their feet, you would beat them mercilessly and then take their horse and armor to ransom back to them later. Though even this was a corruption of the original intent. According to the poet from the 12th century, Henri de Laon, tournaments were not originally held as a way of capturing horses, but so as to learn who was manly in his conduct and to do great deeds of arms. And so it would be known that he could wear a helmet despite the heat and lack of air within as lightly as he would wear his cloth cap. For the man who in such a situation is soaked in his own blood and sweat, this I call the high bath of honor. Though honor seems a relative term because there are stories in those early tournaments of one knight fleeing and going off to some village and then being pursued by his fellow knights, and that would usually end in a lot of like burning, pillaging, and that kind of thing. So, you don't need to ransom stuff back when you can just take it from the peasants. But Max, didn't you just say that that was the point of the tournament, to stop that kind of behavior? Yes, I did. But it took quite a while to do that. It took some rules to be put in place that turned the melee into more of a contest that had prizes that didn't include ransom. Though not everyone liked that change. In a poem written to the young King Henry III in 1220, the author laments the bygone era of late 12th century tournaments. But nowadays, high-ranking men have put chivalry back in fetters too. Errantry and tourneying have given way to formal contests. But if God please, the young King Henry will restore fun, laughter, and joy to the world. But the fun, laughter, and joy of unbridled violence was gone forever from the tournament as they leaned into the sport and contest aspects of the event. Though that's not to say that tournaments weren't still extremely taxing. There's a wonderful letter from an earl to another earl, basically asking for a timeout. An earl to an earl, greetings! An assembly for the practice of knightly skills is refreshed by a modest suspension. One should not cancel it, but let it be interrupted for a brief time, for who can fight without a pause? And even as late as the 16th century, as the warrior knight was giving way to the gentleman knight of later centuries, and tournaments added blunted lances and collision barriers called tilts, the events could still be incredibly dangerous. Even King Henry VIII during a jousting tournament was horribly wounded. The Duke's spear broke and the King's headpiece was full of splinters. So even with the taming of medieval knights, it was still a very brutal lifestyle. I can assure you, you wouldn't find me out there on the tournament grounds. No, I'd be over in the corner, by the food stalls, waiting for my pork chutes to finish cooking. So whether you fried or baked your chutes, go ahead and let them cool, and then they're ready to eat. And here we are. Chutes on Flesh Day. They smell great, and I gotta say, they have a wonderful color. I'm glad I went with baking them, even though I was forced, basically, into doing so. I'm still glad I did. Let's give this a shot. So in that first bite, I got a little bit of filling, but pretty much all I got was pastry. And that's actually kind of apropos because it typically, especially in a case like this, the pastry wasn't really meant to be eaten. You would kind of open it up and then eat the insides from there. So it's kind of appropriate that all I got was pastry, and now I can indulge on the insides. I mean, obviously it looks like a pasty, like a Cornish pasty, which I need to do an episode on. And it kind of tastes like it too in a lot of ways. What's interesting is kind of what the filling is. That ginger. And some of the other recipes have even more spices and interesting things like wine and verjuice added. It's not an overpowering ginger, but just ginger on pork and chicken with egg. That is weird. But it's good. I don't really get the egg. In modern pork pies, they often add hard-boiled egg, and I just don't get why. I don't know. I also wouldn't mind a bit of like gravy or some sort of sauce. It's not dry. It's just there's not a lot holding it together. It's just like pieces of meat. I don't exactly know what would do well with that. Maybe just dump the meat out into some gravy. So whether you decide to fry or bake these, just remember that when you're in the kitchen, if you mess up, it doesn't really matter. Just it's supposed to be fun, and I had fun making them, and I had fun doing this episode. So yeah. So thank you again to Porter Road for sponsoring this video, and make sure to follow me on Instagram, Tasting History with Max Miller, and I shall see thee next time on Tasting History.